Security. Get this woman out of here before she ruins everything. The words cut through the champagne-scented air like a blade, and Magdalene Thompson felt every eye in the opulent ballroom turn toward her weathered hands clutching a small, wrapped gift. Her heart hammered against her ribs as Victoria Cross, resplendent in designer silk, pointed a manicured finger at her like she was diseased. You need to leave immediately. The security guard's voice was firm but not unkind as he approached her near the ornate entrance. Magdalene's eyes darted past him, searching desperately through the sea of expensive gowns and tuxedos for just one precious glimpse of her daughter in white. Please, Magdalene whispered, her voice barely audible above the string quartet. I just want to see. Susan doesn't need to see some deranged homeless woman crashing her perfect day. Victoria's voice dripped with disgust as she glided closer, her husband Richard trailing behind with an embarrassed grimace. This is a private event for invited guests only. How did you even get past the gate? Magdalene's fingers tightened around the small gift, a simple jewelry box that had cost her everything once, though these people would never understand its true value. Through the crowd, she caught a flash of ivory silk and her breath stopped. Susan. Her Susan, radiant and laughing, completely unaware that her mother stood 30 feet away after 12 years of silence. Look at her, Victoria continued, addressing the growing circle of curious guests as if Magdalene weren't standing right there, probably hoping to steal something or cause a scene. Richard, call the police. We can't have this person disrupting Susan and Daniel's special day. The word person landed like a physical blow. Magdalene had faced hostile boardrooms, cutthroat competitors, and ruthless journalists, but standing here in her simple navy dress and worn shoes, watching her daughter's new family treat her like garbage, she felt smaller than she had in decades. I'm not here to cause trouble, Magdalene said, her voice steadier now despite the tremor in her hands. I just wanted to give Susan something that belonged to her grandmother. Victoria's laugh was sharp and cruel. Susan's grandmother is dead, and she certainly wouldn't have associated with someone like you. Security, I won't ask again. The guard stepped forward, his hand gentle but firm on Magdalene's elbow. I'm sorry, but you'll need to come with me. As they began to escort her toward the exit, Magdalene caught sight of Susan turning in their direction, her face lighting up with that same brilliant smile that had melted Magdalene's heart when she was 5 years old. For one impossible moment, their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. Susan's smile faltered. Her champagne flute trembled in her hand. But then Daniel whispered something in her ear, and Susan turned away, choosing her new life over the ghost of her old one. Magdalene let the security guard lead her out, but not before she pressed the small gift into the hand of a young waitress near the door. Please, she whispered urgently. Make sure Susan Whitmore gets this. Tell her it's from someone who has loved her every single day for 26 years. Hey, my friend, hope you're doing well. Drop a comment and let me know how you're feeling about this story so far and where you are watching from. Some stories are too close to my heart to share on YouTube. I send those, along with little life lessons and surprises, to my email circle. If you'd like to be part of it, you can join with the link in the description. As the massive oak doors closed behind her, Magdalene stood on the marble steps of the Rosewood estate, her chest tight with a pain that had nothing to do with her weak heart and everything to do with watching her only child choose strangers over the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her. What Victoria Cross didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Magdalene Thompson hadn't come to the wedding as a beggar seeking scraps of affection. She had come to deliver a warning. Because in 3 hours, the reading of Charles Whitmore's will would reveal that the bride they were celebrating wasn't just Susan Whitmore, struggling graphic designer. She was Susan Thompson Whitmore, sole heir to a business empire worth $3.2 billion. An empire that Magdalene had built from nothing while her daughter grew up believing her mother had abandoned her for money. And the gift Magdalene had just passed along? It wasn't a sentimental jewelry box. It was the key to a safety deposit box containing documents that would prove the Cross family's perfect wedding was built on a foundation of lies, fraud, and a secret that would destroy Daniel's family fortune before the honeymoon suite was even turned down. Magdalene pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and dialed a number she hadn't called in 5 years. Hello, Marcel? It's Maggie Thompson. Yes, I know what time it is. I need you to accelerate the timeline. The merger announcement moves to tonight. She paused, watching through the windows as her daughter danced with a man who had no idea he'd just married the most powerful woman in the state. And Marcel, make sure the Cross family gets the news first. I want to see their faces when they realize they just threw their daughter-in-law's mother out of her own wedding. As Magdalene walked toward the Bentley she'd kept waiting at the end of the long driveway, her simple navy dress and worn shoes hiding the truth that would shatter the fairy tale happening behind those golden doors, she allowed herself one small, bitter smile. Victoria Cross had been right about one thing. This day was about to be ruined. But not by the homeless woman they'd thrown out. By the billionaire they'd just made into their enemy. Inside the Bentley, Magdalene's hands shook as she opened a silver locket she hadn't dared to look at in 3 years. Susan's school photo from age 14 smiled back at her, gap-toothed, freckled, holding a science fair trophy with the same determined expression Magdalene wore in her first board meeting. The usual route home, Ms. Thompson, her driver, James, asked gently through the partition. He'd been with her for 8 years, long enough to recognize the particular shade of devastation that came from Susan-related wounds. No. Magdalene's voice was raw. Take me to the office. And James, call Dr. Patel. Tell him I need my medication adjusted. My heart is. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the irregular flutter that had been getting worse since Susan's engagement announcement hit the newspapers. Just call him. As the car wound through the city streets, Magdalene's phone buzzed with a text from Marcel Rivera, her business partner and the closest thing she had to family these days. Magdalene, I saw the news coverage. Are you okay? The Cross family just released a statement about enhanced security measures at the wedding. What happened? She stared at the message, then opened her contacts to a number she'd memorized but never called. Susan's number. Susan's real number, not the old one from 12 years ago that Magdalene still texted on birthdays, sending messages into the void. 3 years ago, Magdalene had hired the best private investigator money could buy. Not to interfere, never to interfere, but just to know. To know that Susan was safe, healthy, pursuing her dreams. The investigator, Sarah Kim, had become Magdalene's lifeline to her daughter's world, providing quarterly reports that Magdalene read like sacred texts. Susan graduated summa cum laude from art school. Susan won a regional design competition. Susan moved in with Daniel Cross. Susan said yes to his proposal at the same restaurant where Magdalene had once promised 5-year-old Susan they'd have princess tea parties every Sunday forever. Promises that had been shattered by circumstances no 5-year-old should have had to understand. Magdalene closed her eyes, and the memory hit her like it always did, sharp, immediate, devastating. 12 years ago, Mommy, why can't I come with you? Susan's voice had been so small. Standing in the doorway of their tiny apartment in her Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles pajamas, clutching the stuffed elephant Magdalene had won for her at the county fair. Magdalene had been stuffing documents into a suitcase with one hand while holding a burner phone with the other, watching the news report that would change everything. Thompson Industries' biggest competitor had just been exposed for child labor violations, and their government contracts were being redistributed. If Magdalene moved fast, if she took the meeting in Hong Kong and signed the papers that night, she could secure a deal that would set them up for life. It's just for a few days, baby girl. Aunt Susan will take good care of you, and when I get back, we'll go house hunting. Remember? I promised you a room with a window seat where you could read all your books. Susan had nodded, but her lower lip was trembling. At 14, she was old enough to sense when adults were lying about the magnitude of things. But what if something happens to you? What if your plane crashes? What if you don't come back? Magdalene had knelt down, taking Susan's face in her hands. Nothing will happen to me. I promise. And even if something did, you would be okay. You're the strongest, smartest, most amazing girl in the world. But I am coming back, Susan. I will always come back for you. The lie had felt necessary then. Protective. She'd had no way of knowing that Charles Whitmore, Susan's father, the man who'd walked out on them when Susan was 3, had been watching, waiting for exactly this moment. Magdalene's flight to Hong Kong had been delayed by 8 hours due to a storm. 8 hours that Charles had used to convince a judge that Magdalene was an unfit mother who prioritized business over her child's safety. 8 hours during which he'd presented financial records showing Magdalene's erratic lifestyle and dangerous business dealings. 8 hours that had culminated in a court order granting him emergency custody while Magdalene was 6,000 miles away, frantically trying to get home. By the time she'd landed in California, Susan was gone. And Charles had made sure Susan believed it was because Magdalene had chosen money over her daughter. Present day, Ms. Thompson. James's voice broke through the memory. We're here. Magdalene looked up to see the gleaming towers of Thompson Industries headquarters, 43 floors of glass and steel that represented everything she'd built and everything it had cost her. The security guard at the entrance, Miguel, tipped his hat as she passed. He'd worked here for 6 years and still had no idea that the quiet woman who always asked about his granddaughter's soccer games was worth more than most small countries. The executive elevator carried her to the 43rd floor in silence. The hall was empty except for the soft hum of after-hours lighting, but she could see the warm glow spilling from Marcel's corner office. He was waiting for her, as he'd been waiting for 12 years of late-night crisis calls and early-morning breakdowns. Maggie. Marcel stood as she entered, and she could see her own pain reflected in his dark eyes. Marcel Rivera had been Charles Whitmore's college roommate, the best man at Charles and Magdalene's wedding, and the only person who knew the whole truth about what had happened the night Susan was taken. He was also the person who'd been secretly funneling money into Susan's education fund for 12 years, disguising the payments as scholarship contributions so Susan would never know the money came from her mother. I saw her, Marcel. Magdalene collapsed into the leather chair across from his desk, suddenly feeling every one of her 57 years. I saw my baby girl, and she looked right through me. What did you expect, Maggie? You've been a ghost in her life since she was 14. Charles made sure of that. The bitter truth hit her fresh. Charles Whitmore had been a master manipulator, turning Susan against Magdalene with surgical precision. Every birthday gift Magdalene had tried to send, returned to sender. Every letter, intercepted. Every attempt at contact, blocked by court orders and legal injunctions that painted Magdalene as a dangerous obsessive. And Susan had grown up believing all of it. The Cross family threw me out like I was some kind of vagrant, Magdalene whispered. Victoria Cross looked at me like I was dirt on her shoe. And Susan? Susan just turned away. Marcel leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You know she doesn't know who you are now, right? The private investigator confirmed it. Charles told Susan you died in a car accident 5 years ago. That's why she took his last name legally. Susan Whitmore thinks Magdalene Thompson is dead. The words hit Magdalene like a physical blow. She'd known, intellectually, that Charles was capable of such cruelty. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that shattered something inside her chest. She thinks I'm dead. Maggie, Charles showed her fake obituaries. Fake news articles about the accident. He even had flowers delivered to a fake grave site on your birthday every year, taking Susan with him to visit your memory. The investigator has photos. Magdalene stared at Marcel, her brilliant mind, the same mind that had built a business empire from nothing, struggling to process the depth of Charles' deception. But Charles died 3 years ago. Why didn't Susan? Because by then, she'd been grieving you for 2 years. Why would she question it? And Charles will left her everything on the condition that she never seek out information about your accident. He made sure she'd never look for the truth. The room spun slightly. Magdalene gripped the arms of her chair, feeling her heart skip and flutter in the way that had been happening more frequently. So when she looked at me tonight, she saw a stranger. A stranger who happened to know her name and claimed to have something from her grandmother. Marcel paused, his voice growing softer. Maggie, there's something else. The Cross family, they are not what they seem. Magdalene looked up sharply. What do you mean? Marcel pulled out a thick folder and slid it across the desk. I've been investigating Daniel's family since the engagement announcement. The Cross family fortune. It's built on a house of cards. Real estate investments that don't exist, offshore accounts with fabricated balances, and a pyramid scheme disguised as a luxury resort development. How much do they actually have? About negative $12 million. They are broke, Maggie. Worse than broke. They are facing bankruptcy and federal charges for investment fraud. The wedding you just attended, it was funded entirely by advances from investors who think they are backing the next big development in Napa Valley. Magdalene's mind began to race. Which means Daniel Cross married Susan thinking she was a struggling graphic designer with no family money. But tomorrow, when Charles' real will is read, the one that names Susan as heir to your fortune, the Cross family is going to realize they just married into the very wealth they were trying to fake. The irony was staggering. Magdalene had spent 12 years building an empire to leave to the daughter who thought she was dead, while that daughter had married into a family desperately trying to pretend they had the kind of money Magdalene actually possessed. There's more, Marcel continued quietly. Victoria Cross. She's been researching Susan's background for months, trying to find out if there was any family money. She hired 3 different private investigators. Magdalene's blood went cold. Did they find anything? No. Charles's deception was too thorough. But Maggie. Marcel hesitated. One of those investigators contacted Sarah Kim last week. Victoria knows Susan was adopted by Charles. She knows Susan's real mother was named Magdalene Thompson. She just doesn't know Magdalene Thompson is still alive, or that she's you. The betrayal hit Magdalene like a sledgehammer. Victoria Cross hadn't thrown her out of the wedding because she was protecting Susan from a stranger. She'd thrown her out because she was terrified Magdalene was there to claim Susan, and Susan's inheritance. Which meant Victoria Cross knew exactly who Magdalene was when she had her humiliated and escorted out. And Susan, beautiful Susan, still believed her mother was dead. Magdalene stood up slowly, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears. Marcel, I want you to accelerate everything. The merger announcement, the will reading, the press conference. All of it. Maggie, wait. Think about this. If you reveal yourself now, Susan's going to think you lied to her for 12 years. She's going to think you let her believe you were dead while you were building a fortune. She won't understand that you thought Charles had told her the truth about why you left. But Magdalene was already at the door, her mind crystal clear for the first time in years. Then I'll have to make her understand. But first, I'm going to make sure the Cross family pays for what they did tonight. She paused at the threshold, her voice deadly quiet. Victoria Cross humiliated me in front of my daughter's wedding guests. She made Susan watch her own mother get thrown out like garbage. And she did it knowing exactly who I was. What are you going to do? Magdalene smiled, and for the first time in 12 years, it felt genuine. I'm going to give Susan the wedding present she deserves. The truth about what kind of family she just married into. And then I'm going to get my daughter back. As she walked toward the elevator, Magdalene's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk Ms. Thompson, this is Sarah Kim, the investigator. Susan just called me. She found your gift and wants to know who gave it to her. She's asking questions about her grandmother's jewelry. I think the memories are starting to come back. What should I tell her? Asterisk. Magdalene stopped breathing. Susan was asking questions. After 12 years of silence, Susan was finally asking questions. She typed back quickly, asterisk tell her the truth. Tell her that her grandmother's jewelry box contains the key to finding someone who has loved her every day for 26 years. And Sarah, tell her to open the box tonight. Before the will reading tomorrow. Asterisk. Because inside that simple jewelry box was something Victoria Cross's investigators had never found. A photograph of Magdalene and Susan from their last Christmas together, and on the back, in Susan's own childish handwriting. My mommy is the best mommy in the whole world and I love her more than infinity. The memories were about to come flooding back. And tomorrow, when Susan learned that her dead mother was very much alive and had been building an empire to leave to her, the Cross family's perfect plan was going to crumble into ash. The only question was whether Susan would forgive Magdalene for letting her grieve a lie, or whether losing her daughter's love had been the true price of the empire Magdalene had built to save them both. Susan Cross sat on the edge of the four-poster bed in the honeymoon suite, still wearing her wedding dress, turning the small wooden jewelry box over in her trembling hands. The waitress who'd delivered it had vanished before Susan could ask any questions, leaving only the cryptic message echoing in her mind. Asterisk from someone who has loved her every single day for 26 years. Asterisk. Susan, darling, are you coming back down? Your new mother-in-law is looking for you. Daniel's voice carried from the bathroom where he was struggling with his bow tie, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in his new wife's chest. Susan's fingers traced the familiar carved roses on the box's lid. She knew this box. The memory was fuzzy, like looking through water, but she knew it. Her grandmother's jewelry box. The one that had disappeared when she went to live with her father. In a minute, she called back, her voice strangely hollow. With shaking fingers, she lifted the lid. The melody that drifted out, Fur Release, hit her like a physical blow. Suddenly she was 7 years old again, standing on a step stool in a tiny kitchen, helping her mother make Christmas cookies while this exact melody played from this exact box. Her mother humming along, flower in her dark hair, laughing as Susan tried to cut star shapes that looked more like abstract blobs. Asterisk when you're older, Susan Bean, this box will be yours. Grandma Thompson wanted you to have it on your wedding day. Asterisk. Susan's hands flew to her mouth. Susan Bean. The nickname hit her like lightning, unlocking a flood of memories that Charles Whitmore had spent years helping her suppress. Her mother's voice singing her to sleep. Her mother's hands braiding her hair for school pictures. Her mother's tears the night before she left for that business trip. The business trip she never came back from. Except, Susan lifted the small photograph from inside the box, and her world tilted on its axis. The picture showed a woman and a young girl decorating a Christmas tree, both laughing at the camera. The woman had Susan's exact same smile, the same stubborn chin, the same dark eyes that now stared back at Susan from every mirror. But on the back, in her own childish handwriting, were words that made Susan's blood freeze. Asterisk, my mommy is the best mommy in the whole world and I love her more than infinity. Christmas 2012. Susan plus mommy forever. Asterisk. Christmas 2012. 3 years after her mother had supposedly died in that car accident. Susan's mind reeled. The car accident that had taken Magdalene Thompson's life had been in 2009, when Susan was 11. But this photo was dated 2012, when Susan was 14. She remembered taking this photo. She remembered that Christmas morning, remembered her mother promising they'd have their own house by next Christmas, remembered. Oh God, Susan whispered, the pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. She didn't die. She didn't die in a car accident. The box also contained a small brass key and a business card for a safety deposit box at First National Bank. But Susan barely registered them because her phone was buzzing with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk Susan, this is Sarah Kim. I'm a private investigator. Your mother hired me to make sure you were safe and happy. She never stopped loving you. She never wanted to leave you. If you're reading this, then you found your grandmother's jewelry box, and you're starting to remember. Your mother is alive, Susan. She was at your wedding tonight. Asterisk. Susan's champagne glass slipped from her numb fingers and shattered against the marble floor. Susan. Daniel appeared in the doorway, concern creasing his handsome features. What was that noise? Are you? He stopped, seeing the devastation on her face. Sweetheart, what's wrong? The old woman, Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. The one your mother had thrown out tonight. The one who claimed she had something from my grandmother. Susan looked up at Daniel, and he took a step back from the raw pain in her eyes. That was my mother. Susan, honey, your mother died years ago. You told me. I know what I told you. Susan's voice cracked like a whip. But I was wrong. Or I was lied to. Or both. She held up the photograph with shaking hands. This picture was taken 3 years after I thought she was dead, Daniel. 3 years after my father told me she died in a car accident. Daniel moved toward her slowly, like she was a wounded animal that might bolt. Susan, you're not making sense. Why would your father lie about something like that? Susan's mind was racing now, connecting dots that she'd been trained never to see. Because he wanted me to stop asking when she was coming back. Because he wanted me to stop crying for her every night. Because he wanted me to stop hoping. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the gardens where she'd just danced with her new husband an hour ago. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold. Susan, even if there was some kind of misunderstanding about your mother, that doesn't mean the woman tonight was her. There are a lot of disturbed people who. She knew my grandmother's name, Susan cut him off. She knew about the jewelry. And look at this. Susan pulled out her phone and showed Daniel the text from Sarah Kim. A private investigator, Daniel. My mother hired a private investigator to watch over me. Daniel read the message, his face growing pale. Susan, this could be some kind of scam. People target wealthy families all the time, especially around weddings. They research family histories, find vulnerabilities. Wealthy families. Susan's laugh was sharp and bitter. Daniel, I'm a graphic designer. I live in a studio apartment above a coffee shop. What exactly do you think they are trying to scam me out of? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, and Susan caught something flickering across his expression. Something that looked almost like guilt. What aren't you telling me? Susan's voice went deadly quiet. Nothing, I just. Daniel Cross, we've been together for 2 years. I know your tells. What aren't you telling me? Daniel ran his hands through his hair, destroying the perfect styling his groomsmen had spent an hour achieving. Susan, maybe you should sit down. I'm done sitting down. I'm done being protected from things. Talk to me. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the garden where their wedding guests were still dancing, blissfully unaware that the bride's world was imploding 40 feet above their heads. My mother hired investigators to research your background before I proposed, he finally admitted. Susan's blood went cold. You what? Not me. My mother. She hires investigators to research everyone we date seriously. It's what she does. And what did these investigators find? Daniel's silence was answer enough. Daniel, what did they find? Susan, you have to understand, my family has always been careful about. What did they find? Daniel met her eyes, and she saw her own devastation reflected there. They found records of your adoption by Charles Whitmore. They found evidence that your birth mother was named Magdalene Thompson. They found. He swallowed hard. They found discrepancies in the story about your mother's death. Susan stared at him, the final pieces of her shattered world falling into place. Your mother knew. When she had that woman thrown out tonight, she knew exactly who she was. Susan. Your mother humiliated my mother at my wedding, Daniel. She had security drag her out like a criminal, knowing it was my mother. Maybe she was trying to protect you. From what? Susan's voice rose to a shout. From the woman who gave birth to me? From the woman who apparently never stopped loving me? From the truth. There was a sharp knock at the door, and Victoria Cross's voice called out, Susan, darling, is everything all right? Some of the guests heard raised voices. Susan and Daniel stared at each other, and Susan saw the exact moment Daniel realized what was about to happen. Susan, please, don't. But Susan was already at the door, yanking it open to reveal Victoria Cross in all her elegant glory, flanked by Richard Cross and 3 other family members Susan barely knew. Mrs. Cross, Susan's voice was ice. I have a question for you. Victoria's smile faltered slightly at Susan's tone. Of course, darling. What is it? The woman you had thrown out of my wedding tonight. Did you know who she was? The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly that Susan almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Susan, I have no idea what. Her name is Magdalene Thompson. Does that name mean anything to you? Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, and Richard stepped forward, his face grim. Susan, perhaps we should discuss this privately. No, Susan's voice cut through the hallway like a blade. We're discussing this right here, right now. Because I just realized that every single person in this hallway knew more about my own mother than I did. My mother, who I've been mourning for 12 years, who was apparently alive and standing 30 feet away from me 2 hours ago. Susan, Victoria tried again, her voice shaking now. You have to understand, we were trying to protect you. By humiliating her? By having her dragged out by security? By letting me watch my own mother get thrown out of my wedding like she was some kind of vagrant? Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Because she's dangerous, Susan. Magdalene Thompson isn't some grieving mother. She's a ruthless businesswoman who abandoned you as a child to build her empire. She doesn't want a relationship with you. She wants control over you. And how exactly would you know that, Mrs. Cross? The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Victoria's eyes darted to her husband, to her son, to anywhere but Susan's face. Because, Victoria whispered, we know who she really is. Susan felt the last piece of her old life crumble away. And who is she really? Richard Cross spoke up, his voice heavy with defeat. Susan, your mother is Magdalene Thompson of Thompson Industries. She's worth approximately $3.2 billion. And tomorrow morning, Charles Whitmore's will is being read. A will that names you as her sole heir. The hallway went dead silent except for the distant sound of the wedding reception continuing below them, guests dancing and laughing while Susan's entire universe rewrote itself. You married me for money, Susan said quietly. It wasn't a question. No. Daniel stepped forward desperately. Susan, no. I love you. I've loved you since the day we met. The money had nothing to do with. But you knew. All of you knew. Susan looked around the circle of faces, seeing guilt and fear and desperation reflected back at her. You knew I was an heiress, and you let me believe I was alone in the world. You let me plan this wedding thinking I was just some nobody graphic designer who got lucky enough to marry into your family. Susan, please. Victoria's voice was breaking now. You have to understand our position. We have obligations, debts, people depending on us. You're broke, Susan realized suddenly. You're not wealthy at all. You needed me to be wealthy. The silence that followed was deafening. Susan turned to Daniel, seeing the truth written across his face. How long have you known you were marrying a billionaire? Susan, it wasn't like that. How long? Daniel's shoulders sagged. Since the engagement. Susan nodded slowly, feeling strangely calm as her heart shattered completely. So when you proposed to me, when you told me you loved me exactly as I was, when you said you didn't care if I never made more than $30,000 a year as long as we were together, you were lying. I wasn't lying about loving you. But you were lying about everything else. Susan walked back into the honeymoon suite and picked up her phone. With steady fingers, she typed a response to the private investigator. Asterisk Sarah, this is Susan. I want to meet my mother. Tonight. And I want to know everything. Why she left, why she never came back, and why everyone around me has been lying about it for 12 years. Asterisk. The response came back immediately. Asterisk Magdalene is at Thompson Industries headquarters. 43rd floor. She's been waiting for you to call for 12 years, Susan. But there's something you need to know before you see her. Something about why she never tried to contact you directly. Asterisk. Susan typed back, asterisk what, asterisk. Asterisk she thought you were better off without her. Charles Whitmore convinced her that you hated her for choosing business over family. She's been building her empire to give to you, but she never believed you'd want anything to do with her. She loved you so much that she stayed away. Asterisk. Susan stared at the message, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had stayed away not because she didn't love Susan, but because she loved her too much. And the family Susan had just married into had been planning to use her inheritance to save themselves from bankruptcy. She looked up to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his face pale with desperation. Susan, please don't leave. We can work through this. I do love you. I swear I love you. I know you do, Susan said quietly, and she meant it. But you also married me for $3 billion. And your family threw my mother out of our wedding because they were afraid she'd ruin their plans. Susan. I'm going to see my mother now, Daniel. The mother I've been grieving for 12 years, who's been alive and loving me from a distance this entire time. Susan picked up her car keys from the dresser. And when I come back, we're going to have a very long conversation about what kind of marriage we're going to have. What does that mean? Susan paused at the door, looking back at the man she'd married 6 hours ago. It means you're about to find out what it's like to be married to someone who's worth $3 billion and doesn't trust you anymore. As Susan walked past the Cross family in the hallway, still wearing her wedding dress, Victoria called out desperately, Susan, please, you have to understand. We need. Susan stopped and turned back, her voice deadly calm. Mrs. Cross, you threw my mother out of my wedding. You humiliated the woman who gave birth to me in front of 200 guests. You let me believe I was alone in the world while you planned to use my inheritance to save your family from bankruptcy. Victoria's face crumpled. Susan, please. I do understand, Mrs. Cross. I understand perfectly. Susan smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. You need my money to survive. And now you're going to find out what it costs to need something from someone whose mother you just made an enemy of. Susan walked away, leaving her new family standing in the wreckage of their perfect plan. While 2 miles away, Magdalene Thompson sat in her office, staring at her phone and wondering if her daughter would ever forgive her for loving her enough to let her go. The wedding was over. The real story was just beginning. And Susan was about to discover that being worth $3 billion was nothing compared to being worth 12 years of a mother's silent, desperate love. Susan's hands shook so violently on the steering wheel that she had to pull over twice during the 20-minute drive to Thompson Industries. Each time she stopped, her phone buzzed with increasingly desperate messages from Daniel, his family, and numbers she didn't recognize. But it was the message from Sarah Kim that made her blood run cold. Asterisk Susan, your mother collapsed 20 minutes ago. She's at Thompson Industries with paramedics. Her heart condition is worsening. She's been hiding how sick she is. You need to hurry. Asterisk. Susan's foot slammed on the accelerator, her wedding dress bunched around her knees as she raced through the empty downtown streets. Heart condition. Her mother was dying, and Susan had spent 12 years believing she was already dead. The Thompson Industries building loomed against the night sky like a monument to everything Susan had never known about her own life. As she pulled into the executive parking garage, she could see ambulance lights reflecting off the glass walls of the lobby. But it was the man waiting by the elevator who stopped her cold. Marcel Rivera stepped out of the shadows, his face grave. Susan. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Your mother is stable, but she's refusing to go to the hospital until she talks to you. She's been waiting for this moment for 12 years, and she's terrified that if she leaves now, you'll disappear again. Susan followed Marcel into the elevator, acutely aware of how surreal she must look, a bride in full wedding regalia racing through a corporate tower at midnight to see the mother she'd been mourning since she was 14. Marcel, Susan said quietly as they rose toward the 43rd floor. How long have you known my mother? Since college. I was friends with both your parents, actually. I was your father's best man. Marcel's voice carried a weight that made Susan look at him sharply. Susan, there are things you need to know about what really happened 12 years ago. Things that will be difficult to hear. The elevator doors opened to reveal a scene that looked like the aftermath of a battle. Paramedics were packing up their equipment while a woman Susan assumed was Magdalene's doctor spoke in hushed tones with a man in an expensive suit. Papers were scattered across a massive conference table, and through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Susan could see the lights of the city spread out below like fallen stars. And there, sitting in a chair with an oxygen mask over her face, was her mother. 12 years of grief, anger, and longing hit Susan like a physical blow. Magdalene looked smaller than Susan remembered, more fragile, but her dark eyes, Susan's eyes, were exactly the same. Alert, intelligent, and filled with a love so desperate it was painful to witness. Magdalene pulled off the oxygen mask, and her voice came out as a whisper, Susan Bean. Susan's composure shattered completely. She crossed the room in 3 steps and collapsed to her knees beside her mother's chair, years of suppressed emotion pouring out in broken sobs. Mom, I thought you were dead. I thought you were dead, and I missed you so much, and I didn't understand why you left. I never left you. Magdalene's voice was fierce despite her weakness. Susan, I never wanted to leave you. I was trying to build something for us, something that would keep us safe, and when I came back, Magdalene's voice broke. When I came back, you were gone. Susan pulled back to look at her mother's face, seeing the truth written in every line of exhaustion and grief. Dad told me you chose business over me. He said you'd rather make money than be my mother. Your father lied. The voice belonged to Marcel, who was now standing behind them with a thick folder in his hands. Susan, your father took you while your mother was in Hong Kong. He used her absence to convince a judge that she was an unfit mother, and by the time she got back, he'd already filed for emergency custody. Susan's world tilted again. What do you mean he took me? Magdalene reached for Susan's hands with trembling fingers. You were supposed to stay with Aunt Susan for 4 days. I had a contract signing that would have secured our future. Enough money to buy you that house with the window seat we talked about, enough to send you to any college you wanted. But your father had been watching, waiting for me to leave you alone. But why would he? Because Charles was broke, Marcel said grimly. He'd been embezzling from his law firm for years, gambling away everything he touched. He needed to disappear, and he needed you as his ticket to a new life. He convinced the court that your mother was negligent, then moved you across the country while she was fighting the custody order. Susan felt like she was drowning. But the car accident? There was no car accident. Magdalene's voice was barely audible. Charles told you I died because it was easier than explaining why he'd stolen you from me. And I let you believe it because he convinced me you were happier without me. Magdalene pulled out a manila envelope with shaking hands. Susan, every year on your birthday, I would send Charles a letter begging to see you. He would send back photos of you visiting my grave, flowers you'd brought to honor my memory. He convinced me that you hated me for leaving, that you were better off thinking I was dead than knowing I'd chosen work over you. Susan opened the envelope and found dozens of photographs, herself at 14, 15, 16, standing beside a headstone marked Magdalene Thompson, beloved mother. In every photo, she looked genuinely grief-stricken, genuinely convinced she was mourning her dead mother. He made me complicit in my own deception, Susan whispered. And he made me complicit in staying away, Magdalene replied. Every time I tried to fight the custody order, Charles would show the judge photos of you living peacefully without me. He'd present evidence that contacting you caused you distress. He made it look like I was the one traumatizing you by trying to come back. Susan's phone buzzed urgently, and she glanced down to see a text from Daniel. Susan, please call me. My family is panicking. They are talking about lawyers and damage control. I think they are planning something. I love you, but I'm scared of what they might do. The text was followed immediately by another from an unknown number. This is Richard Cross. If you don't return to the hotel immediately, we'll be forced to take legal action to protect our family's interests. Your behavior tonight could be construed as emotional instability. Susan showed the messages to Magdalene and Marcel, watching her mother's face harden with a rage that was 12 years in the making. They are threatening you, Magdalene said quietly. They are threatening my daughter. Marcel was already moving toward his computer. Susan, we need to get ahead of this. The Cross family is desperate, and desperate people do dangerous things. What do you mean? I mean they've invested everything they have in the belief that you'll inherit your mother's fortune and be manipulated into saving them. If they think they're losing control of you, they'll try to destroy you before you can destroy them. As if on cue, Susan's phone rang. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. Susan, thank God. Please, you have to come back. My mother, she's lost her mind. She's calling reporters, claiming you've been kidnapped or brainwashed. She's telling them that Magdalene Thompson is a dangerous criminal who's manipulating you for your inheritance. Susan's blood went cold. She's talking to reporters. Susan, there are news vans outside the hotel. Mom told them that you disappeared from your own wedding and that your dead mother is actually alive and forcing you to. The call cut off abruptly. Magdalene struggled to stand, her face pale but determined. Susan, if Victoria Cross is talking to the media, then she's not just trying to control you anymore. She's trying to destroy me. Marcel was typing furiously on his laptop. The story's already breaking online. Billionaire heiress vanishes from wedding after dead mother's return. They are painting Magdalene as an unstable woman who faked her own death to manipulate you. Susan felt the walls closing in around them. The Cross family had turned her reunion with her mother into a public scandal, and every minute they delayed gave Victoria more time to control the narrative. We have to fight back, Susan said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Susan, Magdalene said carefully, fighting back means exposing everything. It means the world finding out about Charles' deception, about the custody fraud, about what the Cross family really wanted from you. It means your private pain becoming public entertainment. And if we don't fight back, then they win, Marcel said grimly. They paint your mother as an abductor and manipulator. They get sympathy as the victims, and you go back to them as their meal ticket while believing that everyone who's tried to tell you the truth is lying. Susan's phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. Breaking. Wedding night scandal as bride disappears with woman claiming to be her dead mother. The article included photos of Susan leaving the hotel in her wedding dress, descriptions of Magdalene being forcibly removed from the wedding, and quotes from unnamed sources describing Magdalene as unstable and potentially dangerous. They are destroying us, Susan whispered. No, Magdalene said, her voice growing stronger with each word. They are giving us the chance to tell the truth. Susan, I've spent 12 years building an empire in silence, believing I'd lost you forever. I'm not going to lose you again to people who see you as nothing more than a bank account. Magdalene turned to Marcel. Call the emergency board meeting. Wake up everyone. And get Sarah Kim here now. I want all the evidence she's gathered about the Cross family's fraud. Mom, what are you planning? Magdalene looked at her daughter, and for the first time in 12 years, Susan saw the ruthless businesswoman who had built a fortune from nothing. I'm planning to remind the world that you don't mess with a mother who's already lost her child once. Magdalene's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The Cross family wanted to marry into money. They are about to find out what it costs to try to steal it. Susan's phone rang again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. Susan Cross. The voice was crisp, professional. This is Susan. This is Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7 News. We understand you've been reunited with your mother, who was previously believed to be deceased. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to tell your side of the story before. Susan hung up and looked at her mother. They're coming for us. Let them come, Magdalene said. Susan, I need you to make a choice. You can go back to Daniel and pretend tonight never happened. Try to salvage your marriage to a man whose family sees you as a commodity. Or you can stay here and help me fight for the truth. What would fighting mean? It means tomorrow morning, we don't just read Charles' will. We hold a press conference. We expose the Cross family's bankruptcy and fraud. We tell the world exactly what kind of people throw a mother out of her daughter's wedding. Magdalene paused. And it means you have to decide whether you want to be Susan Cross, the woman who was manipulated into marriage, or Susan Thompson, the woman who inherited an empire. Susan looked around the office, at the evidence of her mother's success, at Marcel who had been quietly protecting her for years, at the monitors showing news coverage of her disappearance. Then she looked at her mother, seeing her own determination reflected in those familiar dark eyes. There's something else, Susan said quietly. Daniel, I think he really does love me. He's just caught between his feelings and his family's manipulation. Then he'll have to choose too, Magdalene replied. Because after tonight, there's no middle ground. Either he stands with you against his family's lies, or he's part of the deception. Susan's phone buzzed with another text from Daniel. *Susan, please. My mother just told the reporters that your real mother died years ago and this woman is an imposter trying to steal your inheritance. She's showing them the obituaries your father created. You have to come back and tell them the truth. Asterisk. Susan stared at the message, realizing that Daniel was trapped too, caught between a family that had lied to him about their finances and a wife whose entire history was more complicated than anyone had imagined. I need to call him back, Susan said. Susan, Magdalene started. Mom, if we're going to fight this, we need allies. And despite everything, Daniel might be the only person in his family who actually cares about me more than the money. Susan dialed Daniel's number, putting the call on speaker so Magdalene and Marcel could hear. Susan, where are you? Daniel's voice was desperate. The reporters are asking questions I can't answer. They want to know about your trust fund, about your real parents, about why my mother hired investigators. Daniel, listen to me carefully. Are you alone? Yes, I'm in our room. The woman your mother had thrown out tonight was my mother. My real mother, who I thought was dead for 12 years. Silence. Daniel. Susan, that's impossible. We saw your mother's grave. We have the death certificate. All fake. My father faked everything to keep her away from me. Susan's voice was steady now, clear. Daniel, my mother is Magdalene Thompson, of Thompson Industries. The woman your family researched was me. Another long silence. Jesus Christ, Daniel whispered. Susan, do you know what this means? It means your mother knew exactly who she was throwing out of our wedding. It means your family has been planning to use my inheritance since the day you proposed. And it means that in about 6 hours, when my father's real will is read, I'm going to inherit approximately $3 billion. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel, Susan said softly, I need to know something, and I need you to tell me the truth. When you proposed to me, did you know about the money? Susan. The truth, Daniel. Yes. His voice was barely a whisper. But Susan, I swear to you, by the time I proposed, I didn't care about the money. I loved you. I still love you. But you knew. Yes. Susan closed her eyes, feeling the last piece of her old life crumble away. Then you chose to lie to me every day for 8 months. You let me plan our wedding thinking I was marrying someone who loved me for who I was, not what I was worth. Susan, please. Daniel, there are reporters downstairs calling my mother an imposter and a criminal. Your mother is telling the world that I've been kidnapped or brainwashed. And you just admitted that you've been lying to me about the most fundamental thing in our relationship. What do you want me to do? Susan looked at her mother, seeing 12 years of strength and sacrifice reflected in those tired eyes. I want you to choose, Daniel. Right now. Either you come down here and stand beside me while I tell the world the truth about what happened tonight, or you stay with your family and let them destroy my mother to protect their lies. Susan, if I go against my family, then you'll find out what it's like to choose love over money. The way my mother did 12 years ago. The way she's been doing every day since. The line was quiet for a long moment. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Daniel said finally. As Susan hung up, Magdalene reached for her daughter's hand. Are you sure about this, Susan Bean? Once we start fighting back, there's no going back to the life you had this morning. Susan looked around the office that represented everything her mother had built while missing her daughter's entire adolescence and young adulthood. Then she looked at her phone, buzzing with messages from reporters who were already trying to control her story. Mom, I've been living a lie for 12 years. I'm ready to try living the truth. Magdalene smiled, and for the first time since Susan was 14, it reached her eyes. Then let's show the world what happens when you try to steal from the Thompson women. But even as they began planning their counterattack, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been following Susan from the hotel, or the photographer in the building across the street with a telephoto lens trained on the 43rd floor. The Cross family hadn't just leaked Susan's story to the media. They'd also hired someone to document every moment of what they were now calling Susan's kidnapping by her dangerous, supposedly dead mother. And in 2 hours, those photos would hit the internet with a story that would make the truth almost impossible to believe. The real battle was just beginning. 20 minutes later, Susan watched from the 43rd floor as Daniel's car pulled into the parking garage, followed immediately by 2 black sedans that made her blood run cold. Mom, Susan said quietly, Daniel wasn't supposed to bring anyone. Magdalene looked up from the documents she'd been organizing, her face immediately alert. What do you mean? There are 3 cars down there, and only one of them is Daniel's. Marcel was already at his computer, pulling up the building's security feeds. Susan, step away from the windows. Now. Why? What's? The elevator chimed softly, and Susan felt a chill run down her spine. Daniel's key card would only give him access to the executive floor, but the elevator was stopping on floors 38, 39, 40. They are checking every floor, Marcel said grimly. Susan, this isn't Daniel coming to support you. This is a coordinated search. Magdalene struggled to her feet, her face pale. Susan, get behind my desk. Marcel, call building security. I already tried. The phones are jammed. Marcel's voice was tight with fear. Magdalene, I think we've been set up. The elevator chimed again, and this time it stopped on 43. When the doors opened, Daniel stepped out first, but he wasn't alone. Behind him came Victoria Cross, Richard Cross, and 3 men Susan didn't recognize. One of them was wearing a badge. Susan, thank God. Victoria's voice was syrupy with false relief as she rushed across the office. Sweetheart, we were so worried when you disappeared. The doctors are here to help. Doctors? Susan stepped back, her heart pounding. One of the men stepped forward, his voice professionally calm. Ms. Cross, I'm Dr. Harrison from the County Mental Health Crisis Team. Your family has expressed concern about your emotional state following your traumatic reunion with this woman who claims to be your deceased mother. Susan's world tilted. My family called mental health services. Susan, Daniel's voice was quiet, pained. You left our wedding in the middle of the night, still wearing your dress, to meet with a stranger who's been stalking you for years. Your behavior tonight, it's not rational. Stalking me. Susan whirled to face her mother. Mom, what is he talking about? Magdalene's face had gone ashen. Susan, I hired a private investigator to make sure you were safe. I never stalked. According to our investigation, the deputy sheriff spoke up. Magdalene Thompson has been conducting surveillance on Susan Cross for over 3 years. Bank records show payments to multiple private investigators, security services, and information brokers. There's also evidence of attempted contact despite a restraining order filed by Charles Whitmore. Susan felt the floor drop out from under her. A restraining order. Susan. Victoria's voice was gentle, manipulative. Your father filed it to protect you after this woman began harassing you following your mother's death. Magdalene Thompson developed an obsession with you, claiming to be your deceased mother to gain access to your life. That's not true. Magdalene's voice cracked with desperation. Susan, you have to believe me. Dr. Harrison stepped between them. We're going to need you to step back. Susan is clearly distressed, and your presence is agitating her further. Susan looked around the room, seeing the documents scattered across the table, the oxygen tank her mother had been using, the evidence of 12 years of secret love and protection. Then she looked at Daniel, searching his face for any sign of the man who'd married her 6 hours ago. Daniel, Susan said quietly, you called them. Daniel's face crumpled. Susan, I love you. But when I got here and saw this empire, these documents about you, the surveillance equipment, I realized how deep this deception goes. This woman has been watching you, manipulating your life. Manipulating my life. Susan's voice rose to a shout. She gave up her life for me. She built this company for me. She stayed away for 12 years because she thought I hated her. That's what she wants you to believe, Richard Cross said smoothly. Susan, we have documentation showing that Magdalene Thompson has been systematically gathering information about your financial situation, your relationships, your daily routines. This isn't love, it's obsession. Susan looked at her mother, seeing the devastation in her eyes as the accusations mounted. Mom, tell them. Tell them about Dad, about the custody case, about... Susan. Dr. Harrison's voice was infuriatingly calm. Trauma can sometimes cause us to create elaborate explanations for painful realities. The death of a parent is one of the most difficult experiences anyone can face, and it's not uncommon for people to fantasize about reunion scenarios. This isn't a fantasy. Susan screamed. She has photographs, documents, proof. Photographs and documents can be fabricated, Victoria said gently. Susan, darling, this woman has had 12 years to create an elaborate story designed to manipulate you. She knew about your inheritance. Everyone in the business world knows about Charles Whitmore's will. She's been planning this for years. Susan felt like she was drowning. Every piece of evidence that had seemed so convincing an hour ago was being recontextualized, twisted into proof of manipulation rather than love. But the jewelry box, Susan said desperately. The photograph with my handwriting, which she could have taken from your father's house after his death, Richard said. Susan, Charles left that house unsecured for months. Anyone could have taken personal items. Susan looked at Marcel, desperate for support, but his face was grim. Susan, they are right about one thing. The surveillance was extensive. I handled the payments myself, and from an outside perspective. Marcel, you can't be serious. Susan, I love your mother like a sister, but 3 years of round-the-clock surveillance? Detailed reports about your dating life, your work schedule, your therapy appointments. It looks obsessive. Susan felt the last of her support crumbling away. Even Marcel, who'd been Magdalene's partner for decades, was beginning to doubt. And there's something else, Daniel said quietly. Susan, Magdalene Thompson was never married to your father. The words hit Susan like a physical blow. What? Victoria pulled out a manila folder. We had our investigators dig deeper after tonight's events. Susan, your birth certificate lists your father as Charles Whitmore, but there's no record of Charles ever being married to anyone named Magdalene Thompson. Your mother's real name was Maria Santos. She died in a car accident when you were 3 years old. Susan stared at the birth certificate, seeing her own name but a completely different mother listed. That's impossible. Susan, Dr. Harrison said gently, Magdalene Thompson appears to have created an elaborate fictional relationship with your family. She's a successful businesswoman who became obsessed with a child she encountered somehow, perhaps through business dealings with your father, and over time, she convinced herself she was your mother. But she knew about Susan Bean, Susan whispered. She knew about the Christmas cookies, about the bedroom I wanted. All information that could be gathered through surveillance, Victoria said sadly. Susan, this woman has been watching you for years. She knows everything about your childhood because she's been studying you like a research project. Susan looked at her mother, who was clutching the edge of the desk, her face gray with shock and grief. Mom, tell them. Show them the custody papers, the court documents. Susan, Magdalene's voice was barely a whisper. I don't have custody papers. Charles never filed for custody because he already had it. You lived with him your entire life. The room went deadly silent. What do you mean? Susan's voice was small, broken. Magdalene was crying now, years of suppressed grief pouring out. Susan, I was never your legal mother. I was your nanny. I worked for your father from the time you were 6 months old until you were 14. I loved you like my own daughter, but I was never actually your mother. Susan felt the world explode around her. You're my nanny. I was more than a nanny, Magdalene said desperately. I raised you. I loved you. I was the only mother you knew after Maria died. But when your father remarried and decided he didn't need my services anymore, he fired me. And when I tried to maintain contact with you, he filed the restraining order. So you're not my mother, Susan said numbly. I am your mother in every way that matters, Magdalene pleaded. Susan, I changed your diapers, I taught you to read, I held you when you had nightmares. But you're not my actual mother. Biologically, no. But Susan. And Charles Whitmore was my father. My real father. Who never kidnapped me or stole me from anyone. Magdalene's silence was answer enough. Susan looked around the room, seeing the truth written on every face. Daniel's relief. Victoria's barely concealed triumph. The deputy's professional satisfaction at resolving what he clearly saw as a case of dangerous obsession. Susan, Dr. Harrison said gently, we'd like you to come with us for a brief evaluation. You've been through a traumatic experience tonight, and we want to make sure you're processing everything in a healthy way. And if I refuse? Susan, Daniel stepped forward, his voice breaking. Your behavior tonight, leaving our wedding, believing elaborate stories about conspiracies and fake deaths, it's given us grounds to request a temporary psychiatric hold. I don't want to do that, but I'm scared for you. Susan stared at her husband, seeing the man she'd married transform into a stranger before her eyes. You're having me committed. I'm trying to protect you from someone who's clearly unstable. Daniel gestured toward Magdalene. Susan, look at her. Really look at her. She's an older woman who became obsessed with the child she used to care for. She built an entire fantasy about being your mother, stalked you for years, and then manipulated tonight's events to get close to you. Susan looked at Magdalene, who was now slumped in her chair, the oxygen mask back over her face. For the first time, Susan saw her not as a long-lost mother, but as Dr. Harrison and the others saw her, a wealthy, aging woman whose grief over losing access to a child had twisted into something unhealthy. But the empire, Susan whispered. She said she built it for me. Susan, Marcel said quietly, your mother built Thompson Industries long before she ever met your family. The company was already worth millions when she came to work for your father. So the will. There is no will leaving you anything, Victoria said gently. Susan, Magdalene Thompson has no children. Her estate is set up as a charitable foundation. She's not leaving you her fortune because she legally can't. You're not related to her in any way. Susan felt like she was falling through space. Everything she'd believed for the past 4 hours was crumbling, being revealed as the delusions of a woman who'd never gotten over losing her job as a nanny. Susan, Dr. Harrison said, we really need you to come with us now. You've had a severe psychological shock tonight, Anne. No. Susan's voice was steady for the first time in hours. No, I'm not going anywhere. Susan, I want to see proof. Real proof. I want to see my original birth certificate, the court records from the custody case that never happened, documentation of my father's marriage to my real mother. Susan looked around the room. Because if Magdalene Thompson is just a delusional former nanny, then you should be able to prove it. Victoria and Richard exchanged glances. Susan, Victoria said carefully, those records are sealed. Bullshit. Susan's voice cut through the room like a blade. If you want me to believe that the woman who raised me from infancy is actually a dangerous stalker, then you're going to prove it. Right now. Susan pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Sarah Kim? It's Susan. I need you to bring everything. Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence you've gathered about my family. Bring it to Thompson Industries now. She hung up and looked around the room. We're going to settle this once and for all. Either Magdalene Thompson is my mother and you're all lying to protect yourselves, or she's a delusional woman and I need psychiatric help. Susan, Daniel said desperately, you can't trust Sarah Kim. She's been working for Magdalene for years. Then we'll verify everything independently. Susan's voice was ice. Dr. Harrison, you want to evaluate my mental state? Fine. But I want a neutral psychiatrist, not someone my husband's family called. And I want a lawyer present. Susan, you don't need a lawyer. If I'm supposedly inheriting $3 billion, I absolutely need a lawyer. Susan looked at Magdalene, who was watching the proceedings with growing alarm. And if I'm not inheriting anything, then I need to know why my new family is so interested in having me declared mentally incompetent on my wedding night. The silence that followed was deafening. Susan smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. Because here's what I think is really happening. I think Magdalene Thompson really is my mother, and I think the Cross family is so deep in debt that they are willing to have me committed to prevent me from learning the truth about my inheritance. Susan, that's, Victoria started. Prove me wrong, Susan said simply. Prove I'm delusional, and I'll go quietly. But prove it with facts, not manipulation. Susan looked around the room, seeing fear creep into the faces of everyone except Magdalene, who was staring at her daughter with something that looked like pride. Because if I am inheriting $3 billion, and if you're trying to have me declared incompetent to control that money, then we're not just talking about a family dispute anymore. Susan pulled out her phone again and started recording. We're talking about fraud. The tension in the room was suffocating when Sarah Kim arrived 30 minutes later, flanked by 2 lawyers and carrying 3 boxes of documents. Susan had spent those 30 minutes in deadly silence, her phone still recording while the Cross family, the doctors, and even Magdalene shifted uncomfortably under her unwavering stare. Susan, Sarah said as she entered, I brought everything. But I need to warn you, some of these documents are going to be difficult. I don't care how difficult they are, Susan's voice was steel. I want the truth. Sarah opened the first box and pulled out a thick folder. Susan, let's start with this. Your original birth certificate, filed at St. Mary's Hospital. Susan took the document with trembling hands. The name was correct, Susan Maria Santos Whitmore. Father, Charles Michael Whitmore. Mother, Maria Susan Santos. So Magdalene isn't my mother, Susan said quietly. Biologically, no, Sarah confirmed. But Susan, look at the date. Susan's eyes scanned the document, and her breath caught. This says I was born in 2001. But I was born in 1999. No, you weren't. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. Susan, you were born in 2001. You're 24 years old, not 26. Susan stared at the birth certificate, her mind reeling. That's impossible. I remember my birthdays, I remember. You remember what Charles told you to remember, Sarah said sadly. Susan, when Magdalene came to work for your family, you weren't 6 months old. You were 2 years old, and you'd been severely traumatized. Victoria Cross stepped forward, her face pale. What do you mean, traumatized? Sarah pulled out another folder, this one marked confidential, Child Protective Services. Susan, your mother Maria Santos didn't die in a car accident. She was murdered. The room went deadly silent. Maria Santos was killed by your biological father when you were 2 years old, Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was revealing. But Charles Whitmore wasn't your biological father, Susan. He was your mother's boyfriend, and he killed the man who actually fathered you. Susan felt like she was falling through space. What? Charles Whitmore murdered your biological father, Susan. Your real father was a man named Riley Thompson. Magdalene gasped, her oxygen mask sliding from her face. Riley Thompson was my brother, she whispered. Susan whirled around to face Magdalene. Your brother? Susan, Magdalene's voice was breaking. Riley Thompson was my little brother. He was dating Maria Santos when you were born. He loved you so much, he was going to marry Maria and adopt you officially. But Charles was obsessed with Maria. When she chose Riley over him, Charles killed them both. Sarah nodded grimly. Charles Whitmore shot Riley Thompson and Maria Santos in front of you when you were 2 years old. You were found 3 days later, nearly catatonic from trauma and dehydration. Child Protective Services was looking for next of kin when Magdalene Thompson came forward. You're my aunt, Susan whispered. I'm your aunt by blood, but Susan, from the moment I held you in that hospital, you became my daughter in every way that mattered. Magdalene's tears were flowing freely now. You couldn't speak for months. You'd wake up screaming every night. The doctors said you might never recover from what you'd witnessed. Susan looked around the room, seeing the horror reflected on every face, even Victoria's. But Charles, why did Charles get custody of me? Because he was smart, Sarah said bitterly. Charles Whitmore was a defense attorney. He knew how to work the system. He claimed that Maria had been his common-law wife, that he was your stepfather, and that you'd been living with him when the murders occurred. He painted Riley Thompson as a drug dealer who'd killed Maria in a jealous rage before being killed himself. But that's not what happened. No, Charles killed them both, but he made it look like a murder-suicide. And then he adopted you legally while you were still too traumatized to contradict his story. Susan felt bile rising in her throat. So Charles Whitmore murdered my parents and then raised me as his daughter. Yes, Magdalene said quietly. And when I tried to get custody of you as your biological aunt, Charles convinced the court that I was an unstable woman trying to exploit a traumatized child. He had money, connections, and a plausible story. I had grief and accusations I couldn't prove. Susan looked at the documents scattered across the table, each one revealing another layer of horror. But why change my age? Why tell me I was older than I was? Because, Sarah said, pulling out another file, Charles needed you to be old enough to inherit when he died. Susan, Charles Whitmore didn't just murder your parents. He stole their life insurance money, their savings, everything that should have gone to you. When he realized he was dying of cancer 3 years ago, he needed to make sure you'd inherit his estate, which was actually your parents' money that he'd been living off of for 20 years. The room was spinning. Susan gripped the edge of the desk, feeling like she might collapse. So the inheritance. The inheritance is real, Marcel said quietly. But it's not Charles's money, Susan. It's what Magdalene built from the settlement she got when she finally proved that Charles had stolen your parents' assets. She spent 20 years fighting in court to recover what was rightfully yours. Susan looked at Magdalene with new eyes. You built Thompson Industries with my parents' money. I built it for you, Magdalene said fiercely. Susan, every dollar I earned, every contract I signed, every decision I made, it was all to give you back what Charles stole from you. You are the sole heir to Thompson Industries because it was always meant to be yours. Victoria Cross had gone deadly pale. But Charles S. will. Charles S. will is a fake, Sarah said flatly. Susan, Charles Whitmore died broken in debt. The only reason you're inheriting anything is because Magdalene has been fighting for 20 years to get justice for your murdered parents. Susan stared at Victoria, seeing the desperation in the older woman's eyes. You knew, didn't you? You knew Charles was broke when Daniel started dating me. Victoria's silence was answer enough. That's why you hired investigators, Susan continued, her voice growing stronger. You weren't looking for my family's money. You were trying to figure out why Charles Whitmore's daughter might be worth anything when Charles himself was worthless. Susan, Daniel stepped forward desperately. I didn't know about any of this. I swear to you, I had no idea. Shut up. Susan's voice cut through his protests like a blade. Just shut up, Daniel. She turned to Dr. Harrison, who had been standing frozen throughout the revelations. Doctor, do you still think I need psychiatric evaluation? Because it seems like the only people in this room who are delusional are the ones who thought they could steal $3 billion by marrying me. Dr. Harrison looked uncomfortable. Ms. Cross. Ms. Thompson, Susan corrected sharply. My name is Susan Thompson. It's always been Susan Thompson. Susan looked around the room, seeing the truth written on every face. Magdalene, her aunt who had become her mother through love and sacrifice. Marcel, who had helped build an empire to give Susan back what was stolen from her. Sarah, who had spent years documenting the truth. And the Cross family, who had built their entire plan around marrying her for money that had never belonged to Charles Whitmore in the first place. There's one more thing, Sarah said quietly. Susan, about your age. You're not 24. You're actually 22. Susan's legs gave out. She collapsed into the nearest chair, staring at Sarah in disbelief. What? Charles changed your birth records multiple times to fit his schemes. When he first adopted you, he aged you up to make the timeline work for his story about being your stepfather. When he was dying and needed you to inherit, he aged you up again to make sure you'd be legally adult when he died. Susan put her head in her hands. I don't even know how old I am. You're 22, Magdalene said softly. Susan, you were born on September 15th, 2003. Today is your 22nd birthday. Susan looked up, tears streaming down her face. Today is my birthday. Today is your birthday, Magdalene confirmed. And this is the first birthday in 20 years that I've been able to spend with you. Susan started laughing through her tears, a sound that bordered on hysteria. I got married on my birthday to a man whose family is trying to steal my inheritance, while being reunited with my aunt who I thought was my dead mother, after learning that my adoptive father murdered my real parents. Susan, Daniel said desperately, please, we can work through this. Work through this. Susan's voice rose to a shout. Daniel, your family called mental health services to have me committed rather than let me learn the truth about my inheritance. Your mother knew that my adoptive father was a murderer and was planning to use that information to control me. That's not. And you, Susan turned to Victoria, her voice deadly quiet. You threw my aunt out of my wedding. The woman who has spent 20 years fighting to get justice for my murdered parents. You humiliated her in front of 200 people because you were afraid she'd ruin your plan to steal from me. Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. Susan, you have to understand, we have debts, obligations, people depending on us. People depending on you to steal from an orphan whose parents were murdered. We didn't know about the murders, Richard protested. We just knew Charles was broke and you might have family money. So you decided to marry me for it, Susan finished. Without telling me. Without asking me. You just decided that I was going to be your family's salvation, and you built an entire relationship on that lie. Susan stood up slowly, looking around the room at the wreckage of her life. Daniel, I want you and your family out of this building. Now. Susan, please. You have two choices. Susan's voice was ice. You can leave now, quietly, and maybe we can have this marriage annulled without criminal charges. Or you can force me to call the police and explain how your family attempted to have me committed to steal my inheritance. Daniel's face crumpled. Susan, I love you. I know I made mistakes, but I love you. You love $3 billion, Susan said flatly. You've never loved me, Daniel. You loved the idea of what I could give you. That's not true. Then prove it, Susan challenged. Walk away from the money. Sign a prenup that gives you nothing. Choose me over your family's debts. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, and Susan saw the truth written in his silence. That's what I thought, Susan said quietly. As the Cross family filed out of the office, defeated and desperate, Susan turned to Magdalene. So what now? I'm 22 years old, my parents were murdered, my adoptive father was their killer, and I'm worth $3 billion that I never knew existed. Now, Magdalene said softly, you get to choose who you want to be. Susan Thompson, who builds empires and fights for justice. Or Susan Cross, who lets other people make decisions for her. Susan looked out the window at the city lights below, seeing her reflection in the glass. For the first time in her life, she looked like someone she recognized. "I choose Susan Thompson," she said quietly. "And the first thing Susan Thompson is going to do is make sure the Cross family pays for what they tried to do tonight." Magdalene smiled, and it was fierce with maternal pride. "That's my girl." But even as Susan felt a surge of strength and determination, she could see Daniel's car pulling away from the building, and she knew that choosing the truth had cost her everything she'd thought she wanted. The empire was hers, but she'd never felt more alone in her life. And somewhere in the distance, sirens were approaching the building, because Victoria Cross had made one last desperate call claiming that Susan was being held against her will by dangerous criminals. The fight for Susan's life and fortune was far from over. It was just beginning. The sirens were getting closer when Magdalene suddenly grabbed Susan's wrist with surprising strength, her face pale with a terror that had nothing to do with the approaching police. "Susan, we have to leave. Now." "What? Why?" Susan looked at her aunt, her mother, seeing genuine fear in those familiar dark eyes. "We have all the evidence. The truth is on our side." "You don't understand." Magdalene's voice was urgent, desperate. Victoria Cross didn't just call the police. She called ICE. Susan felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean?" Sarah Kim was already at her laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. "Susan, your immigration status is complicated. When Charles adopted you, he falsified documents about your parents' citizenship. According to federal records, you were never legally documented as a U.S. citizen." "That's impossible. I was born here." "No," Magdalene's voice broke. "Susan, you were born in Mexico. Maria Santos brought you across the border when you were 6 months old, fleeing from an abusive relationship. Riley, your father, was helping her get asylum when Charles killed them both." Susan stared at Magdalene, feeling the last foundation of her identity crumble. "I'm undocumented. Charles' adoption papers list you as a citizen, but they are fraudulent. If ICE investigates your status based on Victoria's claims, they'll discover the truth." Magdalene's hands were shaking. "Susan, they could deport you to a country you've never known, to relatives who don't exist." The sirens were close enough now that Susan could see flashing lights reflecting off the building's windows. Red and blue, but also the stark white of federal vehicles. "How long have you known?" Susan's voice was deadly quiet. Magdalene's silence was answer enough. "How long have you known that I could be deported at any moment?" "Since the day I started looking for you," Magdalene whispered. "Susan, it's why I never tried to contact you directly through legal channels. Any official inquiry into your background would have exposed Charles' lies and put you at risk." Susan felt like she was drowning. "So all these years, you weren't just staying away because you thought I hated you. You were staying away because getting close to me could get me deported." "Susan, I've been working for 20 years to find a way to secure your citizenship legally. The business empire, the money, the connections, all of it was to build enough power to protect you when the truth eventually came out." Susan looked around the office at the evidence of her mother's empire, suddenly understanding it in a completely different light. Every contract, every acquisition, every strategic move, it had all been about building enough influence to protect one undocumented girl from the consequences of a murderer's lies. "But now Victoria Cross has forced our hand," Marcel said grimly, watching the vehicles converge on the building below. "Susan, if you're caught here with evidence of your real identity, ICE can detain you immediately." "And if I run?" "Then you lose everything," Sarah said quietly. "The inheritance, the truth about your parents, the chance to hold the Cross family accountable for what they've done." Susan understood the impossible choice being laid before her. Stay and fight for justice, risking deportation to a country where she had no connections and no life. Or run and hide, letting the Cross family escape consequences while living forever as a fugitive from the truth. "There's something else," Magdalene said quietly. "Susan, if ICE detains you, they'll seize your assets pending investigation. The Cross family could petition the court to claim your inheritance as next of kin through marriage, even though the marriage was based on fraud. Susan, proving that in court could take years. Years you'd spend in detention centers while your inheritance disappears into legal fees and the Cross family's bankruptcy." Susan's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. "Susan, please, my mother went too far. I'm trying to stop this, but I need you to call me. They are going to claim you kidnapped yourself. I can help you, but only if you trust me. Susan stared at the message, torn between hope and suspicion. Was Daniel genuinely trying to help, or was this another manipulation? Magdalene saw her looking at the phone. Susan, don't trust him. Not now. Why not? If he's trying to help. Because, Magdalene's voice was heavy with 20 years of bitter experience. People will say anything when they are desperate. And Daniel Cross has 3 billion reasons to be desperate right now. The elevator chimed, and Susan's heart stopped. But instead of federal agents, it was Daniel who stepped out, alone, his face streaked with tears. Susan, I'm so sorry. I came to warn you. My mother called ICE and told them you were being held by human traffickers. She convinced them that Magdalene Thompson is running some kind of immigration scam. Susan stared at her husband, seeing genuine anguish in his eyes. Why are you here, Daniel? Because I love you. I know I've made terrible choices. I know my family has done unforgivable things. But Susan, I can't let them destroy you. What do you want from me? Daniel pulled out his phone and showed her a recording app. I recorded my mother's call to ICE. I have evidence that this is retaliation, not a legitimate immigration concern. But Susan, to use this evidence, you'd have to trust me. Susan looked at the phone, then at Magdalene, who was shaking her head violently. Susan, it's a trap, Magdalene said urgently. If you go with him, you're putting yourself at the mercy of the people who just tried to have you committed. But if I don't go with him, I lose the evidence that could save me. Susan could hear footsteps in the stairwell now, multiple sets, moving fast. ICE agents didn't use elevators during raids. They secured all exits. Susan, Daniel said desperately, there's a way out. My family has a private plane at the municipal airport. I can get you out of the country before ICE processes the detention order. To where? Canada. You'd be safe there while we fight this legally. Susan looked at Magdalene, seeing the anguish in her mother's face. If I leave the country, what happens to you? Susan, they can't deport me. I'm a citizen. But if you're caught here, we both lose everything. And if I run, I'm admitting guilt. I'm admitting that I don't belong in the only country I've ever known. Susan could hear radio chatter in the stairwell, voices coordinating a search of the building. Time was running out. Susan, Magdalene said softly, 20 years ago, I made the choice to let you go because I thought it would keep you safe. I've regretted that choice every day since. Don't make the same mistake I did. What do you mean? I mean fight. Even if it costs us everything, even if they deport you, even if we lose the money and the business and the chance for justice, fight for the truth. Don't let them make you disappear. Susan looked at her mother, this woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her, and felt something crystallize in her chest. Fear, yes, but also a fierce determination that felt like coming home. Daniel, Susan said quietly, give me your phone. Daniel handed over the device, and Susan deleted the recording of Victoria's call. Susan, what are you doing? Daniel's voice was panicked. I'm choosing to fight, Susan said simply. Without your family's help, without your evidence, without anything except the truth. Susan, you'll be deported. Maybe, but I won't be silenced. Susan looked around the office one last time, memorizing the empire her mother had built for her. Magdalene, if they arrest me, I want you to liquidate everything. Every asset, every investment, every dollar. Susan. And I want you to use it to create a foundation. For undocumented children whose parents have been murdered. For kids like me who fall through the cracks because their immigration status makes them invisible. Magdalene stared at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. Susan, that's your inheritance. That's what your parents died for. No, Susan said firmly. My parents died because a man decided their lives didn't matter. The money is just money. But the choice to fight for other people like me, that's what would make them proud. The stairwell door burst open, and ICE agents flooded the floor, weapons drawn. Susan Thompson, you're under arrest for immigration violations and fraud, the lead agent called out. Susan stepped forward, her hands visible, her voice clear. I'm Susan Thompson. But I'm not under arrest. I'm surrendering voluntarily to tell you the truth about what's happened here tonight. As the agents approached, Susan felt Magdalene's hand slip into hers, squeezing tight. Whatever happens, Magdalene whispered, you are my daughter. You are an American. And you are worth fighting for. Susan squeezed back, feeling her mother's strength flow into her bones. Then let's fight. The agents were reading Susan her rights when her phone buzzed one last time. A text from an unknown number. Asterisk Susan, This is Rebecca Martinez from Channel 7 News. We're broadcasting live from outside Thompson Industries. Half the city is watching this story unfold. If you have something to say, now is your chance to say it to the world. Susan looked at the phone, then at the agents surrounding her, then at the windows overlooking the street where news crews and protesters were gathering. She had lost her husband, her inheritance, and potentially her freedom. But she had found her voice. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything. "Officer," Susan said clearly, "before you arrest me, I'd like to make a statement to the press. About my murdered parents, my fraudulent adoption, and the family that tried to steal my inheritance by having me declared mentally incompetent." The agent looked uncertain. "You have the right to remain silent." "I'm waiving that right," Susan said firmly. "I want to tell the world exactly what happened here tonight. All of it." Susan looked at Magdalene one last time, seeing pride and love blazing in those dark eyes. Because sometimes the only way to win is to make sure everyone knows what they tried to take from you. The agent nodded reluctantly, and Susan walked toward the windows, toward the cameras, toward the moment that would define the rest of her life. She was 22 years old, undocumented, and possibly about to be deported. But she was also the daughter of two people who had died for love, raised by a woman who had built an empire to protect her, and married to a man who had finally chosen truth over money. And she was done being silent. The real fight was about to begin. Susan stepped toward the wall of windows overlooking the street, where news crews had multiplied like bacteria under a microscope. Dozens of cameras pointed up at the Thompson Industries building, their lights turning the night into an artificial day. But it was the crowd gathered behind the media barriers that took Susan's breath away. Hundreds of people. Young faces, old faces, families holding signs in Spanish and English and languages Susan couldn't identify. Signs that read "Justice for Susan," "Immigrants are Americans," and "Murderers don't get to decide citizenship." How did they know to come? Susan whispered. Magdalene moved beside her, her face filled with an emotion Susan couldn't quite identify. "Susan, there's something I need to tell you before you speak to them. Something about why I really built this empire." "Mom, whatever it is can wait." "No, it can't." Magdalene's voice was urgent. "Susan, you weren't the only child Charles Whitmore destroyed. And the Cross family isn't just broke. They are part of a network that's been trafficking children and falsifying adoption records for decades." Susan whirled around. "What are you talking about?" Magdalene pulled out one final folder, this one thicker than all the others. "Susan, when I started investigating Charles's background 20 years ago, I discovered that your case wasn't isolated. Charles Whitmore was working with a network of lawyers, social workers, and wealthy families to steal children from undocumented immigrants." Susan's blood went cold. "How many children?" "We've identified 4 to 7 cases over 15 years. Children whose parents were murdered, deported, or disappeared. Children who were then adopted by wealthy families who paid Charles and his network to provide them with clean adoption papers. And the Cross family has been buying children for wealthy clients for over a decade," Marcel said grimly, joining them at the window. "Susan, Daniel wasn't their first attempt at marrying into an inheritance. They've done this before, identified young adults who were trafficked as children, married them, and then had them declared mentally incompetent to steal their assets." Susan felt like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. "Daniel knew." "We don't think so," Magdalene said quickly. "But Victoria and Richard Cross absolutely knew." "Susan, are families of the missing children," Magdalene confirmed. "Susan, when I started building Thompson Industries, it wasn't just to leave you an inheritance. It was to build enough power and resources to expose the entire network." Susan's mind reeled. "So my case was part of a larger investigation." "Your case was the keystone," Magdalene said fiercely. "Charles Whitmore was the mastermind, but he died before we could expose him. The Cross family was our way to bring down the entire operation." Susan looked at the ICE agents surrounding them, suddenly understanding why they looked uncomfortable. "Do they know?" The lead agent stepped forward, removing his earpiece. "Ms. Thompson, I'm Agent Rodney with ICE, but I'm also part of a joint task force that's been investigating child trafficking networks. We've been waiting 20 years for someone brave enough to go public with evidence against this operation." Susan's legs nearly gave out. "You're not here to arrest me. We're here to protect you," Agent Rodney said. "Ms. Thompson, your aunt has been working with federal authorities for over a decade to build a case against the trafficking network. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of that investigation. Magdalene took Susan's hand. Susan, when I said I was building an empire for you, I meant it. But I was also building a weapon to destroy the people who stole your childhood and the childhoods of dozens of other victims. Susan looked around the room, seeing everything with new clarity. The documents, the surveillance, the careful planning, none of it had been about money. All of it had been about justice. The Cross family walked right into our trap, Marcel said with grim satisfaction. By trying to steal your inheritance, they exposed themselves as part of the trafficking network. Every move they made tonight was documented by federal agents. Susan's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Susan, I'm outside. Please, I need to tell you something about my family. Something I just figured out. It's worse than you know. Susan showed the message to Agent Rodney, who nodded. Bring him up. But Ms. Thompson, be careful. We believe Daniel Cross may have information that could help us save other victims, but his family is desperate enough to do anything to stop him from talking. 5 minutes later, Daniel stepped off the elevator looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. His face was pale, his hands shaking, and there was blood on his shirt. Susan, my family just tried to kill me, he said without preamble. The room went deadly silent. When I told them I was going to testify against them, my father, he pulled a gun. He said I was going to destroy 40 years of business for a girl who shouldn't even be in this country. Daniel's voice broke. Susan, they've been selling children. For decades. And I've been living off the profits my entire life without knowing it. Susan stared at her husband, seeing the genuine horror in his eyes. Daniel. There's more, Daniel continued urgently. Susan, they have other victims. Right now, there are 3 young women being held at our family's estate, all of them adopted through Charles' network, all of them married to men who are stealing their inheritances. Agent Rodney was already on his radio. We need tactical teams at the Cross estate immediately. Multiple victims in immediate danger. Susan felt the weight of revelation crushing down on her. I'm not the only one. You're not the only one, Magdalene confirmed. But Susan, you're the first one brave enough to fight back publicly. And your courage tonight is going to save lives. Susan looked out the window at the crowd below, understanding now why they were there. These weren't just supporters. They were families who had been searching for missing children for years, journalists who had been investigating the trafficking network, activists who had been fighting for justice. They are all waiting for you to speak, Magdalene said softly. Susan, what you say tonight could bring down a network that's destroyed hundreds of families. Susan felt the magnitude of the moment settling on her shoulders. She was 22 years old, undocumented, and traumatized. But she was also the daughter of murder victims, the survivor of a trafficking network, and the heir to an empire built for justice. I want to speak to them, Susan said firmly. Agent Rodney handed her a microphone connected to a speaker system. Ms. Thompson, the entire country is watching. Are you ready? Susan looked at Magdalene, seeing 20 years of love and sacrifice reflected in those familiar eyes. She looked at Marcel, who had helped build the weapon that would bring down her parents' killers. She looked at Daniel, who had chosen truth over his family's blood money. And she looked at the documents scattered across the table, evidence of crimes that had destroyed dozens of lives. Susan stepped to the window and raised the microphone. My name is Susan Thompson. Her voice carried clearly over the crowd, amplified by speakers that broadcast her words to news networks across the country. 20 years ago, my parents were murdered by a man named Charles Whitmore. I was 2 years old, and I witnessed their deaths. The crowd below fell silent, hundreds of faces turned upward. Charles Whitmore then adopted me illegally, falsified my immigration documents, and spent 20 years convincing me that my real family was dead. But tonight, I learned the truth. My aunt, Magdalene Thompson, has spent 2 decades building a business empire and working with federal authorities to expose the trafficking network that stole my childhood. Susan's voice grew stronger with each word. I also learned that I'm not the only victim. Charles Whitmore and families like the Cross family have been trafficking children, falsifying adoptions, and stealing inheritances for decades. Tonight, as I speak to you, there are other victims being held against their will, being robbed of their identities and their futures. Susan could see people in the crowd crying, holding up photos of missing children. I was supposed to be deported tonight. I was supposed to disappear quietly while my traffickers stole the empire my aunt built to fight for justice. But I'm not going anywhere. Susan's voice rose, carrying across the downtown streets. I am Susan Thompson, daughter of Riley Thompson and Maria Santos, who died fighting for the right to build a life in America. I am an American by choice, by love, and by the sacrifice of everyone who believed I was worth saving. And I will not be silent while other children suffer what I suffered. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Susan wasn't finished. To every family searching for a missing child, every survivor hiding from their traffickers, every person who has been told they don't belong in the only country they've ever known, we are Americans. We are worth fighting for. And we will not disappear. Susan lowered the microphone and turned back to the room, seeing tears streaming down Magdalene's face. Susan, Agent Rodney said quietly, there's something else. The president has been watching this broadcast. He's prepared to sign an emergency executive order granting you and all identified trafficking victims immediate pathways to citizenship. Susan stared at him. What? Your courage tonight, Ms. Thompson, has just changed immigration policy for hundreds of victims. You didn't just save yourself, you saved everyone. Susan collapsed into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. In 4 hours, she had gone from a bride believing she was marrying for love to the face of a national movement for trafficking victims' rights. Magdalene knelt beside her chair. Susan, I need you to know something. Everything I built, everything I fought for, it was all worth it to see you stand up and fight for other people the way you just did. Susan looked at her mother, her aunt, her guardian, her champion, and felt something click into place in her chest. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly who she was. What happens now? Susan asked. Now, Magdalene smiled, we get to work. Because dismantling a trafficking network is just the beginning. We have an empire to run, victims to help, and a country to remind that love is stronger than fear. Susan looked out the window one more time, seeing the crowd beginning to disperse but the news crews staying to cover the federal raids happening across the city. In the distance, she could see helicopters heading toward the Cross estate, carrying agents to rescue the other victims. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Susan, this is Maria Gonzalez. I'm 19 years old, and I think Charles Whitmore trafficked me too. After watching your speech, I'm ready to come forward. Can you help me? Susan showed the message to Magdalene, who smiled through her tears. That's victim number 48, Magdalene said softly. And she won't be the last. Susan typed back, Maria, you're safe now. We're going to help all of you. Come to Thompson Industries tomorrow morning. We have lawyers, counselors, and resources waiting. Susan looked around the room one final time, seeing the evidence of her parents' murder, her own trafficking, and her mother's 20-year fight for justice. Tomorrow, she would inherit an empire. But tonight, she had become something more valuable than a billionaire. She had become a voice for the voiceless. And the fight for justice was just beginning. Daniel approached her carefully. Susan, I know I don't deserve to ask, but can we start over? Not as husband and wife, but as people who want to do something good with what we've learned. Susan looked at him, seeing genuine remorse and determination in his eyes. Daniel, you can start by testifying against your family and helping us find every victim they've trafficked. After that, we'll see. As the agents began collecting evidence and preparing to transport the Cross family members who had been arrested during the raids, Susan felt her phone buzz again. This time it was a message from the President of the United States. Susan, your courage tonight has inspired the nation. I'm prepared to sign the Susan Thompson Act tomorrow, providing immediate relief for all trafficking victims. America is stronger because you chose to fight. Susan showed the message to Magdalene, who started crying all over again. Susan Bean, Magdalene whispered, your parents would be so proud. Susan took her mother's hand, feeling the weight of 20 years of grief and love settling into something that felt like peace. I know, Susan said softly. I can feel them watching. Outside the windows, the city lights stretched toward the horizon, full of possibility and hope. And for the first time in her life, Susan Thompson was exactly where she belonged. 6 months later, Susan stood at the same floor-to-ceiling windows of the Thompson Industries building, but everything had changed. The 43rd floor had been transformed into the headquarters of the Susan Thompson Foundation, and the conference table where she'd learned the truth about her parents was now surrounded by survivors, lawyers, and advocates working to dismantle trafficking networks across the country. Susan. Magdalene's voice was warm, familiar, no longer carrying the desperate edge of someone afraid of losing everything. The President's team is on line 1. They want to discuss the expansion of the Susan Thompson Act to include international victims. Susan turned from the window, smiling at the woman who had become exactly what she'd always been, her mother in every way that mattered. Magdalene looked healthier now, the constant stress of 20 years of secret investigations replaced by the purposeful energy of someone whose life's work was finally bearing fruit. "Tell them I'll call back in an hour," Susan said. "I want to finish the interview with Maria first." Maria Gonzalez sat across from Susan at the smaller conference table, her hands steady as she spoke into the recording equipment. At 19, Maria had been one of 43 trafficking victims they'd identified and rescued in the 6 months since Susan's wedding night confession. Her story was heartbreakingly similar to Susan's: parents murdered, identity falsified, childhood stolen by people who saw children as commodities. "The hardest part," Maria was saying, "wasn't the abuse or the isolation. It was believing that I didn't matter enough for anyone to look for me." Susan reached across the table and squeezed Maria's hand. "You matter. You've always mattered. And now the whole world knows it." The interview was being recorded for the documentary that would air next month, Stolen: The Susan Thompson Story, which would expose the full scope of the trafficking network and celebrate the survivors who had found the courage to speak out. Susan's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Just finished testifying in the Cross family trial. The prosecution thinks we'll get convictions on all counts. Dinner tonight to celebrate. Susan smiled, looking at the message. Her relationship with Daniel had been one of the most complicated parts of her journey toward healing. Their marriage had been annulled within weeks of her revelation, but something deeper had grown between them, a partnership built on shared trauma and mutual determination to fight for justice. Daniel had testified against his own family, helping prosecutors secure convictions for trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. Victoria and Richard Cross were now serving consecutive life sentences, and the estate that had once seemed so elegant was being sold to fund victim services. But the man Susan had married was gone, replaced by someone she was slowly learning to trust again. They weren't lovers anymore, might never be again, but they had become something rarer, true allies in a fight that mattered more than romance. Dinner sounds good, Susan texted back. But Marcel is cooking at the house. You know the rules. Susan had bought a sprawling estate in the hills outside the city, but it wasn't the mansion of a billionaire. It was a working ranch that served as a safe house for trafficking survivors, a place where young adults could heal while learning skills and building new identities. Marcel had appointed himself head chef, and family dinners were sacred. Everyone who lived on the ranch gathered around the massive kitchen table every night to share food and stories. "Susan," Maria said, pulling her attention back to the interview, "I have something I need to tell you. Something I've never told anyone." Susan leaned forward, giving Maria her full attention. "When I was first taken, when I was 7 years old, I was held in a house with other children. There was a girl there, maybe 2 years old, who cried for her mama every night." Maria's voice was steady, but tears were streaming down her face. "She had your eyes, Susan." And she kept saying Susan Bean over and over. Susan's heart stopped. "Maria, what are you saying?" I think I knew you when we were children. I think we were in the same trafficking house before you were adopted by Charles Whitmore." Susan stared at Maria, memories flickering at the edge of her consciousness. Fragments of images, other children, a dark room, someone singing softly in Spanish to calm the crying. "Do you remember a song?" Susan asked quietly. "Someone singing Las Mananitas?" Maria's eyes widened. "That was me. I sang to you every night until they separated us." Susan felt 20 years of suppressed memories rushing back like a tide. The other children, the fear, and one small girl who had become her protector in the darkness, singing Mexican lullabies until Susan fell asleep. "Maria," Susan whispered, "you saved me. Even then, you were saving me." Maria smiled through her tears. "And now you're saving all of us." Susan reached across the table and pulled Maria into a fierce hug, understanding suddenly why this girl had felt so familiar from the moment she'd walked into the Foundation offices. They weren't just fellow survivors, they were sisters forged in the darkest moments of childhood. "Family meeting," Susan called out to the busy office around them. "Right now." Within minutes, the conference room filled with the people who had become Susan's chosen family. Magdalene and Marcel, of course, but also Sarah Kim, who now served as the Foundation's head of investigations. Agent Rodney, who had become their liaison with federal law enforcement. Dr. Harrison, who had apologized profusely for his role in the Cross family's deception and now donated his services to help survivors heal from trauma. And Daniel, who had driven straight from the courthouse still wearing his suit from testifying against his parents. "What's wrong?" Magdalene asked, seeing the tears on Susan's face. "Nothing's wrong," Susan said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Everything's perfect. Maria and we've known each other since we were children. We were trafficked together before Charles adopted me." The room fell silent, then erupted in exclamations of amazement and joy. Magdalene started crying immediately, and Marcel began planning an impromptu celebration dinner. But it was Daniel who stepped forward and spoke the words that captured what everyone was feeling. "Susan, do you realize what this means? You found each other. After 20 years, through everything that happened, through all the lies and separation and trauma, you found each other." Susan looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her family through choice rather than blood, through shared purpose rather than shared genetics. And she understood that this moment was what her parents had died for, not just her survival, but her ability to build something beautiful from the wreckage of their loss. "I want to tell you all something," Susan said, her voice clear and strong. 6 months ago, I was Susan Cross, a woman who thought she was alone in the world, married to a man who was lying to her, grieving a mother who was actually alive. I thought my biggest problem was deciding where to hang our wedding photos. Everyone laughed, remembering how far they'd all come. But today, I'm Susan Thompson, daughter of Riley Thompson and Maria Santos, raised by Magdalene Thompson, protected by Marcel Rivera, investigated by Sarah Kim, defended by Agent Rodney, and... She paused, looking at Daniel, loved by someone who chose truth over family loyalty. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I'm also the sister of Maria Gonzalez, who sang to me in the darkness when we were children and didn't even know it." Susan reached for Maria's hand. "And I'm the founder of a movement that has saved 43 children and counting." Susan walked to the window, looking down at the street where a small memorial garden had been planted for Riley Thompson and Maria Santos. Every day, families of trafficking victims left flowers there, along with photos of children they were still searching for. But most importantly, I'm exactly who I was always meant to be. A woman who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. A daughter who honors her parents by protecting other people's children. An American who proves every day that this country is stronger when we choose love over fear. Susan turned back to the room, seeing pride and love reflected in every face. The Cross family thought they could steal my inheritance. But they never understood what my real inheritance was. It wasn't money. It was the knowledge that love is stronger than hate, that truth is more powerful than lies, and that courage is contagious. Susan's phone rang, and she glanced at the screen to see a number she recognized, another survivor, ready to come forward. "Susan," Magdalene said softly, "your parents would be so proud of who you've become." "I know," Susan replied, answering the phone, "because I can feel them in every life we save." As Susan began talking to the newest survivor, offering hope and resources and the promise that they were no longer alone, the room around her buzzed with the energy of people who had found their purpose. Marcel was already planning a welcome dinner for the new arrival. Sarah was coordinating with agents to begin a new investigation. Magdalene was reviewing funding requests from other cities wanting to replicate their model. Daniel was preparing legal documents to protect another young survivor's rights. And Maria was setting up for the next interview, ready to help other victims find their voices. Susan looked around the room one more time, remembering the terrified bride who had been thrown out of her own wedding 6 months ago. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that the most beautiful inheritances weren't measured in dollars but in lives touched, families reunited, and futures restored. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. *Susan, I'm writing from Romania. I saw your documentary trailer online, and I think my sister was trafficked to America 15 years ago. Her name is Anna Popescu, and she would be 23 now. Can you help me find her? *. Susan smiled, typing back quickly. * will start looking tomorrow. Send me everything you know about her, and don't give up hope. We bring families home. *. Because that's what Susan Thompson did now. She brought families home. Susan looked out the window at the city lights stretching toward the horizon, each one representing a life that could be touched, a family that could be reunited, a child who could be saved. Tomorrow, she would wake up in a house full of survivors who had become siblings. She would eat breakfast with a woman who had sacrificed everything to build her a weapon for justice. She would work alongside people who had chosen fighting for others over protecting themselves. And she would go to sleep knowing that somewhere in the world, a mother was getting a phone call telling her that her stolen child was coming home. Susan's inheritance hadn't been money after all. It had been the chance to prove that love could triumph over the darkest evil, that broken things could be made beautiful again, and that courage was the most valuable thing you could pass on to the next generation. Susan Thompson was exactly who she was meant to be, and the work of bringing other people home was just beginning. 1 year later, Susan stood at a podium in the Rose Garden of the White House, looking out at an audience that included 127 trafficking survivors, their families, and the advocates who had fought alongside them. President Stanley was about to sign the Susan Thompson International Protection Act, extending trafficking victim protections worldwide. But Susan's eyes weren't on the president or the cameras or the historic moment unfolding around her. They were on the front row, where Magdalene sat beside Maria, both of them beaming with pride. Next to them sat Marcel, who had just been nominated for a humanitarian award for his work with the foundation. Sarah Kim was there with 3 other survivors she'd helped locate and rescue. Agent Rodney had brought his own daughter, who wanted to be an FBI agent when she grew up so she could save kids like Susan did. And at the end of the row sat Daniel, who had quietly become one of the foundation's most effective advocates, using his legal skills and his story of choosing truth over family loyalty to help other survivors navigate the complex process of reclaiming their lives. Susan stepped up to the microphone, looking out at the faces of people who had become her family, her army, her proof that broken things could indeed be made beautiful again. 2 years ago, Susan began, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn. I was thrown out of my own wedding because my new family was afraid of a woman they thought was a dangerous stranger. Today, that woman, my mother in every way that matters, sits in the front row as we expand protections for trafficking victims worldwide. Susan paused, letting the weight of the transformation settle over the crowd. I used to think that inheritance was about money, that family was about blood, and that home was about the place where you were born. But I learned that the most valuable inheritance is the courage to fight for what's right. I learned that family is about the people who choose to love you and protect you. And I learned that home is wherever you build something beautiful with the people you love. Susan looked directly at Magdalene, seeing tears streaming down her mother's face. To every trafficking victim watching this, to every family still searching for a stolen child, to everyone who has been told they don't belong in the only country they've ever known, you matter. Your story matters. Your courage matters. And we will never stop fighting to bring you home. Susan stepped back as President Stanley signed the bill that would change immigration law forever, but her mind was already on tomorrow's challenges. 3 new cases had come in this week. A family in Thailand was searching for their daughter who had been trafficked to Los Angeles. A young man in Chicago had just realized his adoption was fraudulent. A network of trafficking houses had been discovered in Texas, and the FBI needed the Foundation's help interviewing the survivors. The work would never be finished. But Susan had learned that the most beautiful inheritances weren't things you received, they were things you gave away. And every time she helped another survivor find their voice, every time she brought another family home, every time she proved that love was stronger than hate, she was honoring the legacy of 2 people who had died believing their daughter was worth saving. Susan Thompson had inherited more than an empire. She had inherited the chance to change the world, one rescued child at a time. And that was an inheritance she would spend the rest of her life sharing with anyone brave enough to fight alongside her. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Susan felt her phone buzz with a message from a number she didn't recognize. Susan, my name is Riley Kim. I'm 16 years old, and I think I was trafficked from South Korea when I was a baby. After watching the bill signing today, I'm ready to tell my story. Can you help me find my real family? Susan smiled, typing back, Riley, you're safe now. Come to the Thompson Foundation tomorrow morning. We specialize in bringing families home, and we never give up. Because that's what Susan Thompson did. She brought families home. And she would never stop. What did this story teach you about the power of choosing truth over comfort, courage over silence, and love over fear? Susan's journey from a manipulated bride to a fearless advocate shows us that our greatest inheritances aren't material wealth, but the strength to fight for others and the courage to transform our pain into purpose. Drop your thoughts in the comments about what Susan's story means to you, and subscribe for more stories that will change how you see the world. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation happens when we realize that our greatest gifts come not from what we receive, but from what we choose to give away. Susan Thompson found her voice by refusing to be silenced. What story are you ready to tell? What inheritance of courage are you ready to claim? The world is waiting for your voice. Don't let anyone convince you that your truth doesn't matter. Because it does. And so do you.